breakdown when Kevin was 2. He remembered his dark depressions and also admiring his father's physical strength. He often criticised his mother for her selfishness and her rules, and he felt that he could never trust her. The possibility of my inconsistency was terrifying to Kevin, and he tried to ward this off in every possible way. At times he was menacing, and in the counter-transference I felt transfixed, and as if any wrong step would take me into a landmine. At these times, interpretations in relation to transferences to me were intolerable and unhelpful. The effect on Kevin was that he had to fight for his life. It was too dangerous for him to admit that he had a relationship with me, as this, he said, gave me power over him. Furthermore, it seemed to me that it represented my imposition of my temporality over his. The link between his past and the present were humiliating to him. He demanded that I give him my holiday dates months in advance, so as to ensure he could go away too. This wasn't only to save paying fees if he was away when I was working, but also as a way of asserting his independence, and often he would miss sessions before breaks. Kevin was always meticulously on time for sessions, however, despite not having a watch. This seemed to ensure that he couldn't be criticised for breaking an agreement. My holiday breaks were, by contrast, interpreted by him as a breach of our contract. My temporality was intruding on his. From the beginning of our work together, any small changes in my consulting room were experienced by him as an imposition, and his anxiety was voiced in furious rage. Despite Kevin's fear of change, the unbearability of the present could also drive him to the verge of violence, and he fantasized about stabbing anyone who might get in the way of whatever he needed to distract him from his terrifying anxiety. He had been involved in some serious fights in pubs when he was younger. At times I felt fearful for my own physical safety. When I said to him it seemed as though he was trapped in the present, he experienced this acknowledgement of his state, a relief. Later on in his analysis, he was increasingly able to recognize that an experience would pass. However, this often took the form of getting something over with or getting rid of someone, such as a dentist, as soon as his treatment was over. Kevin had to be the agent of change. Others' temporalities threatened him profoundly. He was explicit about his anger with his mother, conveying how from his birth she could never be relied on. Kevin had been trapped in the vicissitudes of her temporality and never put first. Kevin would say, "I want everything and I want it immediately." He particularly wanted money and status and resented that he had to work for this. Most of all, he wanted to be loved. He hated having to think of the consequences of his actions in the future, but he did care about the consequences of not getting what he wanted, and calculated carefully as to how he could get what he needed, without risking the loss of the other's love. Kevin was contemptuous of others' passivity. It reminded him of the unavoidable passivity of that which is integral to humanness, being mortal and being vulnerable to suffering. Kevin was eternally vigilant. He could never allow himself the passivity of sleep. When he felt vulnerable to me, he would drift into a repetitive fantasy of running round and round a sports field, perhaps in an identification with his father, which reassured him of his strength. Kevin was triumphant each time he felt he'd won a battle. His idealization of his aggression protected him from his unconscious experience of extreme vulnerability to others' rules, their time. His search for a diagnosis was also rooted in his thirst for omnipotence, and from time to time he would make an appointment with a psychiatrist in order to determine what his problem was. It seemed as if he could have indisputable scientific knowledge about himself. He would be more in control. He could research it and predict its course, which he could not do with our psychoanalytic relationship. As I've highlighted, a crucial aspect of Kevin's analysis was the question as to whether two subjects with their own different temporalities could exist without one consuming the other. Winnicott's theorising of the importance of holding in the spatial sense as containing and in a temporal sense enabling the continuity of the infant's self through time is relevant to Kevin's experience. His parents' inconsistency had been and continued to be a source of endless anxiety for him. In response, he tried, as some theories of narcissistic states described, to omnipotently freeze time. Levinas's accounts of the other's time as necessarily disrupting one's own contributes further to a more extensive understanding of the intersubjectivity of Kevin's temporality and my own. The other, the analyst, in his or her difference, opens out the future and intrinsically exposes the subject to uncertainty. For Kevin, every movement of mine that was unexpected threatened to throw him violently into the unknown of the future. The moments when he could enjoy the surprise of my difference, however, were profoundly moving, as was his ability to express gratitude to me for these. Working analytically and from within a phenomenological perspective, which emphasises the importance of attending to descriptions, my attentiveness to Kevin's language, verbal and non-verbal, was crucial. Possible directions for the development of a theorising of a relation between time and language in the psychoanalytic relationship are indicated in Freud's paper, Constructions and Analysis. This paper reflects an interesting tension between Freud's view of truth and its relation to recollection and his acknowledgement of the significance of language and temporality in the psychoanalytic relationship. Freud's argument is concerned with the truth of the analyst's construction of an event in the patient's past. Since agreement or disagreement on the part of the patient might equally be forms of resistance, it can be difficult for the analyst to be certain of the construction's accuracy. For Freud, the search is for a, I quote, complete and trustworthy picture of everything that the patient has repressed. He argues that the psychoanalyst has an advantage over the archaeologist, as memories are always preserved somewhere, unlike historical artifacts which can be destroyed. He implies problematically, in my view, that there are fundamental memories which are unchangeable pieces of historical truth lying within the psyche. That is, if one looks beyond the screen memories and other forms of defences. However, he also writes, almost as if in parentheses, that, I quote, the time and manner in which he conveys his constructions to the person who is being analysed, as well as the explanations with which he accompanies them, constitute the link between the two portions of work of analysis, between his own part and that of the patient. This statement highlights the importance of a relationship in which constructions take place. It is necessarily temporal, since its efficacy when presented to the patient relies on its timing at a specific point in the relationship, namely when such a construction can be experienced as meaningful by the patient. The work of analysis occurs between the analyst and the patient, with the analyst offering a possible construction and the patient responding with a further spontaneous association. For Freud, the production of an association analogous to the analyst's interpretation indicates confirmation of the correctness or truth of a construction, which corresponds to a preserved memory. However, what is understated by Freud is the importance of construction as an opening out of possibilities through language, in the sense that we always say more than we know. These constructions are meaningful between the patient and the analyst, but they're also contingent truths, or rather perspectives, which hold at a particular moment in time, but which can also shift over time to be replaced by new stories from fresh angles. As Ricoeur writes of human temporality, it involves an interrelationship between history's indirect reference to the past and the productive referent of fiction. That's a quote. The emergence of a fresh perspective within the psychoanalytic relationship, which is accepted by the patient, is attributed by Freud to its timing. He implies that the timing of an interpretation involves ascertaining that the patient is free of resistance at that moment and ready to absorb a piece of truth, an accurate construction of a past event. The rightness and the timing of a construction or any other form of interpretation depends on a conscious or unconscious recognition that something meaningful at a specific moment within the transference relationship has been crystallized. It's not because it turns out to be an accurate reflection of the past in any empirical or lasting sense. Even if the construction points to the past, its production relies on the taking up of a new position within time. It allows for a separation from the past, and as a new articulation of an experience, it also opens out to possibilities of new ways of speaking in the future. I now want to return to the question of how, as analysts, we can address the socio-historical in our practice. In her autobiography, Lost in Translation, Eva Hoffman vividly describes how she becomes embodied through her experiences of alienation as a young Jewish immigrant in Vancouver, struggling to find a place in a radically different culture whose collective history she doesn't share. Out of time with this new culture and severed from her childhood in post-war Poland, she swirls in a world where her previous, she says, grid of mental imagery, the historical and cultural structuring of her perception, which informed her previous experience, no longer has relevance. Now, in this country, this strange country, her vision is literally blurred. Her alienation is, I quote, inscribed in my flesh and face, and her shoulders are bent with the strain of resentment and ingratiation. Hoffman rages at the impossibility of inhabiting Canadian English with the deftness and spontaneity she enjoys in her native Polish. The enormous cultural shift is simultaneously a temporal one. For Hoffman, time stops as she desperately tries to freeze the past and resist the future. I want to stop the flow. As a punishment, I exist in the stasis of a perpetual present, that the other side of living in the present, which is not eternity but a prison. I can't throw a bridge between the present and the past, and therefore I can't make time move. Later on, as a young woman in New York, Kennedy's assassination highlights how, for her, not knowing the historical background makes the foreground harder to grasp. At college, she finds that aspects of her history and her present, now she is older, do seem to converge with some of the other young Americans, including her sense of dislocation. But the historical sources of their dislocation differ from hers and her American peers, and her American peers consequently refuse assimilation, while her own uprootedness is underpinned by a longing for a sense of home. Hoffman recognizes that, I quote, she's been written in a variety of languages, and it's an important moment when she dreams in English, discovering that words can be, I quote, a transparent medium in which I live and which lives in me. Her realization echoes Merleau-Ponty's view that in our listening, words become, I quote, the transparent envelope of a meaning within which we might live, and not signs to be deciphered. Her descriptions challenge the dichotomies of inner and outer that permeate much of psychoanalytic theorizing. Subjectivity is for her intrinsically sociocultural and socio-historical. Later on in her book, she muses that it is as if she has two unconsciousnesses, an American one and a Polish one. These both carry their own histories and the histories of others with whom she is being connected. This is a radical departure from notions of the unconscious as containing alinguistic or ahistorical impulses. For Hoffman, the unconscious is historically and culturally constructed, and this is evident through her descriptions of her life. Hoffman's concept of the unconscious converges somewhat with Merleau-Ponty's. He strongly criticises naturalistic notions of the unconscious prevalent in psychoanalysis, and drawing on Freud's later work, presents a new formulation in which conscious and unconscious are not conceptualized as such discrete realms. He questions how the unconscious can be made up of instinctual impulses if it selects what it admits to consciousness and makes us avoid thoughts or situations that we are resisting. For Freud, the superego is located in both the conscious and the unconscious. Merleau-Ponty concludes that the unconscious is, I quote, not unknowing, but rather an unrecognized and unformulated knowing that we do not want to assume. It is this, Merleau-Ponty claims, that Freud leans towards in his later work, and he suggests that it might be better formulated as ambiguous perception. In the analyst's awareness of the socio-historical as intrinsic to our conscious and unconscious experience, there is implicit in this an orientation to the possibility of change. Every moment produces a new context for a different possibility of experience. This is vividly illustrated by the discussion which followed Elsa's report of a dream. She was aged 50 and born in the mid-1950s. My mother is serving food that I have prepared, substituting a particularly important dish of mine with one that she has cooked. I become enraged and lose my temper, screaming at her that her breasts are hoovering up everything in sight. For Elsa, her dream encapsulated in an almost surreal way her experience of 1950s mothering. The cost to her individuality was enormous, she felt. Her mother's care could not nurture, it imposed on her, and as the dream indicated, denied her own creativity and seemed to suck the very existence out of her. Elsa recalled the power of her mother's large and heavy vacuum cleaner, which generated so much noise that as a child she felt she couldn't be heard. Although I didn't comment explicitly on the historical period, I think that my orientation to the atmosphere and values of that particular time increased my sensitivity to Elsa's particular experience. I was also attuned to the dream as containing a reminder for Elsa of the importance of her own creativity, symbolized by the various dishes she herself had cooked. In her fury, she fights for this creativity, which unconsciously she is able to value. These interpretations, arising from a phenomenological psychoanalytic perspective, encompass both the socio-historically specific restraints on Elsa's individuality, which dated back to her childhood, and also her capacity for creativity within her present and future life. They contrast radically from interpretations which assume the existence of an unconscious containing timeless instincts. The interpretations which arose in our discussion about the dream exemplify clearly how an acknowledgement of the socio-historical aspects of temporality can contribute to a richer and more complex understanding of an individual's experiences. The familial constellations in which individuals grow up are shaped by specific socio-historical contexts and cannot be adequately theorized in terms of Oedipal or pre-Oedipal dynamics. Universalizing interpretations of this type do not address the uniqueness of the positions within which individuals recurrently discover themselves amongst matrices of crisscrossing identifications stretching back to the past and forward into the future. Psychoanalytic attunement to the socio-historical requires an acknowledgement of difference and of change. This orientation in the analyst's relationship with a patient is vital for the emergence of new possibilities of being in the individual's life. It contrasts to notions of instincts as raw alinguistic impulses or of the universality of the archetypes. It allows for multiple meanings of experience, which shift as they are perceived from within different temporal contexts.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, we have some time for questions, which is very nice. And it's also nice to have some chemical material,
Right.
which is considered indispensable in psychoanalysis,
Yes.
as far as I can tell. Can I invite some questions from the floor? Yes, please.
During your talk, I think you said something about the conflict in Freud's thought between he is,
Mm-hmm.
impulse of coming and going, which are immortal, non-changing, and the thinks his ego to change.
Yes.
Could you say something about that?
Well, I think his writing is very full of contradictions. I mean, there's sort of the notion of the impulses as being timeless, as being constant, and yet at the same time he talks about them being subject to change and that they can be altered. And so the reason that part of the paper is perhaps quite complex is that he seems to shift around, and I think there are very different interpretations and readings of that. I do think, you know, there are radical possibilities of understanding and being responsive to non-linear conceptions of time, which are very, very important. But there is, I think, a lack of clarity in him, and he acknowledges that himself.
Well, I've talked enough this morning, so I'll be extremely brief. One is a question precisely about that the indication that the unconscious is timeless doesn't seem to me to necessarily coincide with the statement that drives are timeless or out of time. So even if drives are unconscious, they might still have a history, even if they are contained, so to speak, or they develop within an unconscious, a timeless unconscious. Anyway, that's something to think about. The other thing, very, very brief to say, was a story about a patient who, or rather a man, who meets a Freudian analyst, and the Freudian analyst asks him, "Where are you coming from?" And then this man continues to go and meets a phenomenologist who asks him, "Where are you?" And then he moves on and meets a Jungian analyst who asks him, "Where are you going?" So I don't know whether that sums up in a very superficial way some of the things we were trying to say.
Well, I think it's really important that we do have access to as many metaphors as possible in a way, and that's why I think trainings that you know, cross Freud, Klein, Jung, Lacan phenomenology, and our own readings of other kinds of philosophy and literature, that they all allow, and film, and, you know, various arts forms all allow for the possibility of different languages. I mean, the problem I have with the notion of instincts, although I know that's, you know, slightly less problematic in relation to drives, but I think it's something, you know, that Lacan more explicitly addresses, is the relation of language. And the reason that I find Merleau-Ponty very interesting is that he's very interested in cultural differences, and that how we are in our embodiment unconsciously is very culturally and historically specific, and he would argue that we can't talk about sexuality or anger, and we all know what that is, as something sort of outside language, that sexuality and anger are experienced by different people in different ways, and have different words, that anger might not be the same for a white European. It would be experienced in a different way from somebody within a different linguistic and cultural context. It wouldn't be an it, in fact, outside that. Yes, John?
I was thinking about this notion of the timelessness of the unconscious. I mean, there are different notions of the unconscious, or two in particular, fighting it out in Freud's text, aren't there? I mean, there is the notion of a sort of primordial unconscious that's there from the beginning, which comes in particular with ego and the id. But there is also the unconscious of the 1915 psychoanalyst
Mhm.
And that's a very different understanding from some sort of primordial, biologically based, sort of pulsating, whatever, ahistorical reality
Mhm.
that is therefore invoked to give different meanings to the so-called timelessness of the unconscious. Whereas the timelessness of the repressed unconscious seems to be a different thing from primordiality.
Yes. And do you think it's from that Laplanche takes his position that you were talking about this morning then?
Yes, very much so. Yes, very much so. He does battle with the notion of the primordiality of the unconscious. Very much so.
I mean, despite that, I still don't feel Freud goes far enough in relation to questions of language. And that's why I'm very interested in phenomenology, because, I think that emphasises that much more in relation to our whole experiences of embodiment and language and intersubjectivity.
Yes. Yes, the lady.
I was really taken by your account of the woman whose dream